Organising your mix session is the topic of today's discussion. Hi folks, I'm Mike and I hope you're well. Now if you're not organised with your mix sessions, then you could be wasting hours on trying to find things or making silly mistakes and having to correct them instead of producing awesome mixes. So today I'm going to give you 5 steps to organise your mix so that you can be way more productive. Now before we get into that, if you'd like this kind of content all about DAWs, plugins, gear reviews, that kind of thing, then please do subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that you can get to see my future videos. Now let's get stuck into those 5 steps.
1.
So here we are in Studio One, my DAW of choice, but if you're using another DAW, it doesn't matter. These tips are still going to apply to you. Now we're looking at a track which is a nightmare to work with. It's got 37 tracks all in all, and beyond that I can't tell much about it. If for example I wanted to start off by mixing the guitars, well, where are the guitars? Which channel on the console do they go through? Which track are they in the track view? I've got no idea. And that's because of the very first thing which isn't covered. They are not named. So I'm going to start off by naming the tracks in this song. Now, there's no real rules for naming. You can name them as you wish as long as it's something meaningful, I suppose. But one thing you might want to consider if you're using an external controller at all, whether it's a hardware controller or maybe an app on your tablet or on your phone, they sometimes do shorten the names down to around about 8 characters normally. So if you create a really long name, it may get shortened to something which is not very meaningful. So for that reason, I tend to keep the names fairly short. So for example, this first one, which is a vocal, I might call it Vox, oops, excuse my typo, Vox main, and that comes out on my controller as Vox main with the space removed. So that's the only consideration. Now, in order to name all of these tracks, I'm going to have to go through and listen to each one, which is going to take a while. So thankfully, I'm going to speed up the video right now. Now I can tell you I didn't enjoy that at all. It's a very tedious task. The other problem which occurs if you don't name things right from the beginning when you're actually tracking is you can get those original yucky names on the actual recorded clips themselves. So you can see this one up here is actually called track 1 instead of being what I renamed it to, which is Vox main. Now thankfully I can still rename it in Studio One, but it's another tedious task which I will complete with the magic of video now. The next thing you might want to do is color the channels in your console. So I'm going to pull up the full screen view of the console, and let's go for example down to these group of tracks down here. They are all drum tracks. I'll select them all like this, and in Studio One I'll just click down here near the name and I'll select a color. Let's make them purple for example. Now that makes it really quick and easy for me to see exactly where all of my drum tracks are. A simple thing which is very effective. Now again, there's no standards to this. There's no particular color that you should choose, but I would suggest that from one song to another that you tend to use the same colors. That's going to really help you get into the habit of finding things very quickly. Now again, by the magic of video, I'm going to go through and recolor all of my tracks just with the click of fingers like this. Okay, so while I was colorizing the tracks, I thought of something very important which is worth mentioning. If you take all of these drum tracks, for example, they're actually all coming from one plugin, and that's Addictive Drums. Now, when you use plugins like this, say Addictive Drums or Session Drummer or one of the Tune Track drums, you will find that when you initially set it up, it just outputs to one stereo track, and that's not very useful when it comes to mixing, because say you want to adjust, say, just the level of the snare, it's a pain to have to go into the plugin itself and adjust it on the mixer there. It's much better to have all of the drums and the overheads and the rooms all come out to a separate channel so that you can control them straight from your console in your DAW. Another place where that occurs is Contact. With Contact, you can load up loads of instruments in it, and by default it does output to one stereo track. You can set it up to multiple outputs, and if you want to know how to do that, please check out my video which I made about that, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. Now let's minimize that console view, and I'm going to show you a couple of housekeeping tips to really help you along with organizing your mix. First of all, I'm going to talk about folders. They're called different things in different DAWs, but here in Studio One they're called folders. So I'm just going to select all of the ukuleles here. I'll select all of those, and I will right click and click on Pack Folder, and now they're all tucked away in one folder, which I can just call uke. And I can go on through all of my instruments like that, and that just makes the track view itself very tidy. So I'm going to do that in a moment. The last thing that I want to mention before we move on is use markers. Don't set up markers now. It's best to set up markers near the beginning of the tracking process. So I've actually got a bunch of markers set up on this track. I've got them hidden, so I'll switch them on, and you can see it's immediately easy for me to go from verses to bridge and know exactly which part of the song is which. Don't skip using markers. You'll slow yourself down if you do. Now, again, there's no specific way to do it. There's no convention. I particularly just like to put, say, V1 and the first few lyrics of that verse there. That really helps me to figure out which part of the song I'm in.
2.
So the next thing I'd like to talk about is channel order on your main console. Now, there's no real hard and fast rules for this at all. You can do it as you wish. I do suggest consistency again, keeping it relatively the same from one song to another. Now, there are a few considerations that I take into account. I happen to use a MIDI controller, and you may do as well, and they tend to be, if you've got smaller ones, in banks of 8. So I like to make sure, for example, that all of my drums are either going to start from track 1 or track 8. That way, when I'm banking through, the drums are always together. Now, I don't happen to normally do that, so I actually have the drums on track 8. I like my vocals to be from track 1, and then perhaps the guitars, in this case ukuleles. You can do it as you wish. That's just my preference. A lot of people do put the drums right at the beginning. Another thing I've considered in this one is I've got all the drums together, and I've actually got the bass right next to the drums, because you're often, when you're mixing, listening to the bass or the bass guitar at the same time as the drums and trying to blend those two things together. So it's just handy to have them close together on the console. Other than that, there really are no hard and fast rules. Just make it as logical as possible. Scrolling down here, you can see that I've got, obviously, I've got many tracks for this choir that I've got on the end of this song, and I've got those all grouped together. It would be crazy to have them all over the place. And my main instruments, like the piano and the music box, are also together, and things like my percussion instruments, from the cajon, finger clicks, tambourines, I've got them all relatively close to each other so that I'm not jumping around while I'm mixing. That's all you have to really do for that, but it's handy to actually put some thought into your track orders.
3.
Now, the next tip I'd like to give in terms of organizing your mix is all about bus channels. Now, bus channels are very useful tools indeed, and they're used in a few different ways. Basically, they are another audio channel which you can send one or more audio channels through. Now, they have some uses, as I say. One of the most basic uses is to create a submix. So I'm going to add a new bus channel just in here in Studio One by right-clicking and adding. It's called Bus 1 at the moment, and I'm going to select all of these drums here, and I'm going to set their output to that bus 1 which I just created. Now, if I play this track, you will see that all of the drums are coming through this bus 1 here. So if I turn it down, all of the drums go down. You'll notice that all of the drum faders are still in the same positions they were in. That's important for later, but just remember that. If I turn it back up, then the drum level comes back up. So that's one of the main ways that you can use a bus, to create a sub mix. Now, one of the most important ways you can use a bus is for effects sends. Now, the way that works is that you create a new bus. Like I've got two buses here. I've called them delay and reverb. One of them has a delay plugin in the insert. The other one has a reverb, and I can send one or more of my drums through to those effects. Now, you may wonder, why not just put those effects as inserts on those drums? Well, let's take a look up here at this snare drum. I've got two effects put on the inserts here. There's delay, which I will now switch on, and then following that delay is a reverb. I'll just hit the snare drum once. You can hear that delay is working on that snare. I'll just turn it up a bit. Now I'll switch the reverb on. And you can hear that reverb being applied to each of the delays which comes. So what's happening is the snare is going through the delay is doing its stuff of playing the signal again and again, and that signal is then going through to the reverb and having reverb played to it each time. So it happens in sequence, starting from the top of the chain and working its way down through. Now this is quite different when you set it up as a send. So I'll set up the delay as a send here, and then I'll also add a send for the reverb after that. Now the important thing to understand with sends, first of all, is that you control the level of the signal which goes through to the send, but the original signal is kept intact, so that dry snare drum will be kept intact. Now let's first of all send it off to the delay, and I will play that snare again, and you can see on this delay channel down here it's still playing. Now, if I then add to the reverb and I will play again, you heard the reverb on the very first hit, but you're not hearing it on the subsequent hits. And that is because the sends act more like forks. They sort of fork off to the buses. They do not go in sequence through each other. So that's a very, very important thing to bear in mind. Now, the other thing I'd like you to keep in mind is this, and that is where this effect occurs. If I actually keep the drum pattern playing, I'll turn the delay off, and I'll just play it so that that snare is going through the reverb. Now let's go back to the first bus that we created, which controlled the overall volume of the drums, and we'll turn that down. And you can see there that the reverb is still playing, even though we can't hear the actual snare. And that is because the signal from the snare came down here and went through the reverb before it got to the fader. Now, although we can't hear the snare, its fader is still turned up. So to all intents and purposes, the signal is still going through there. So it's a kind of an odd one that you have to be careful with that one, because you can actually mess up your mix between the drums themselves and the effects they're being sent to. And it doesn't make too much difference whether you change this to a pre and post fader effect. It's still going to go through to the reverb one way or another. I'll play it again. I've now changed that to a pre-fader effect. I've turned the drums down, and you can still hear them going through that effect. So you need to be mindful of that when you're using reverbs in that way. You may, of course, put that reverb through to this bus as well. That's one way of handling it, but I'm about to talk about another way of handling it in my next tip, and that is VCAs.
4.
So another great tool that we can use to organize our mixes is VCAs, or voltage controlled amplifiers. Now VCAs are not available in all DAWs. They're in Studio One, Reaper, Cubase, Pro Tools, Logic and Mixbus, but not in some of the others. So if you're still weighing up which DAW to use, then this may affect your considerations. So how do we use a VCA? Well, in some ways it's similar to a bus. You can use it to create submixes. So let's take a whole bunch of drums here again, and this time I'll right click, and instead of adding a bus for the selected channels, I will add a VCA. So this new VCA is added up here. It has a red fader to show us it's a little bit different, and you'll notice right away that you cannot use inserts and you cannot use sends on a VCA channel, and that's because there's no actual audio passing through it. It's used as a kind of a remote control for other faders. We'll see that in a moment. So you may be asking, Well, why bother if you can't use sends and inserts? Why not just use a bus? And that's because there are some key differences which may affect whether you use a VCA or a bus. So let's first of all use a VCA. I'm going to drag that new fader down, and you will see all of the drum faders go down accordingly. Notice that as they go up and down, they maintain their relationship with each other. So if, for example, we took this hi-hat here and we put it really, really high in the mix right up there, as we drag the VCA fader down, it goes down as well, but it maintains its relationship with all of the rest of the drums. That's a really, really important thing. If we go back to the problem we had earlier, where when we were adjusting the master bus or the sub mix of the drums using a bus, when we dragged it all the way down to the bottom, the signal was still going through to the reverb effect. Well, that doesn't happen with a VCA, because as you drag the VCA down, the actual fader on each channel is going down. So if we play our track, and you'll hear, let's put the reverb up pretty high, so you can hear it there on the snare. And we'll drag that fader down and look at the signal in the reverb channel. That also goes down and fades out with everything else. So that's a really, really handy feature, and I find that very, very helpful when I'm using VCAs. Of course, if you didn't want that to happen, you've still got the option of changing that across to a pre-fader send, so that when you drag the VCA down, that signal is still going through to the reverb. So I'm going to go ahead back to my original track, and I'm going to sort out the mix there using a combination of buses and lots of VCAs, and I will see you back in that mix.
5.
So here we are back in the main song that we started with, which started off really disorganized and hard to manage, and we've gone a long, long way to organizing it and making our workflow much, much better. So I'm ready to show you the final tip, but let's just take a look at what we've done so far. Of course, in the track view here, everything is much more organized with so many things being in folders. It's much easier to manage this now and see where we are in the song, but it's really in the console view where it's all happened. We've renamed and we've recolored. And then, if you remember, in the last tip, we took groups like, and I've done it with this ukulele here, and we added VCA. So if we scroll all the way down here, you will see that here, all of those channels, which were the ukulele channels, have all gone through to this one. All of the guitar ones have gone through to this one, the guitar. So I've used VCAs to control sort of groups of signals which represent one instrument and put them all together and control their volume as one. I've used buses here just for effects. There's a reverb effect here which gets used by lots and lots of instruments, so it's shared, and basically I have a vocal sidechain compression thing going on here as well. Now, the last tip is this. Once you've created all these VCAs, and you could do this with buses as well if you don't have VCAs, but once you've created all of these submixes, you can then feed them through to other submixes. So for example, I've taken all of the instruments here, the ukulele, guitars, drums, percussion, and they all go through to this VCA, which is just called instruments, and I've capitalized it. So if I move that up and down, you will see all of the instrument VCAs go up and down, and of course further on out of view the other faders are going up and down those individual instruments. I then take the vocal VCAs, which is just the lead vocal and the choir here, and I send them through to a master VCA, which is for vocals. So that means just these two VCAs here, the instruments and the vocals, you can get a balance just between the background music and the vocals there, which is just a fairly important mixing sort of decision. Now I go a little step further, and then I take the instruments and the vocals and I send them through to one final VCA, which is just called mix. Now you don't really have to do this, it's a sort of a little habit of mine. The reason I put it there is because as you're mixing, you will sometimes find that your master bus just gets louder and louder even after gain staging. Now I like to make sure that my master bus doesn't peak at over -3, somewhere between -3, -6 is good. But if it should go higher than that and it gets close to clipping or is clipping, then I tend to use this mixed VCA, which is a sort of a master fader, just to bring the whole track down a little bit, and that's actually taking everything down relatively across the board. So I really find that a handy way to adjust my overall mix without messing around with the master fader itself. It's just my way of working, and I like doing it like that. You could choose not to use that part of it. So that really concludes everything in terms of the organization of the mix. Of course, the other thing that you can do is make templates for commonly used setups that you have. For example, you know, this setup wouldn't be very useful for a basic singer-songwriter setup where you just have 4 or 5 tracks, and for that you may be much more simple and not use buses and VCAs quite so much, but you would create a template for that and you would get up and running much quicker. Now, if you've got any tips you would like to share about the way you organize a mix, then please let us know in the comments down below. If you've got any questions whatsoever about this video, then please do ask in the comments, and I will try my very best to get to each and every one of you. Now, if you like this video, please do hit the like button. If you didn't like this video, hit the dislike button twice. If you like this kind of content, then please do subscribe and ring the bell on YouTube so that it tells you about my future videos. Now, before I go, I would like to send a shout out to Vachi from Recording Studio 9. Myself and him made a video a couple of months ago where we discussed this kind of topic, and it was that video that inspired me to put it together in 5 steps. So big thanks to Vachi. I will put a link to his channel in the description down below. It's awesome and you can learn heaps from him as well. Now, if you want to watch another video, I might suggest one of the 2 that are showing just here right now. If you don't want to watch one of those 2, then please click on a thumbnail with a yellow background. It will help me enormously. Now you can go.